Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bad Art, the world's premier anti-art podcast. I'm Carl McLaughlin-Alcock, here as always with my co-host.
I'm Marielle Grushko.
And today on the pod, we're going to be talking about creative city urban planning. Creative city urban planning is an approach to urban planning which prioritizes investment in the arts as a means to achieve other urban development goals. Listeners, many of you are already probably familiar with the relationship between art and gentrification, where city governments promote arts districts and public art projects as a way of sparking real estate development. That's one example of creative city planning, but the idea is actually much bigger than that. Creative city advocates often claim that art can be a solution to an array of urban social problems, including drug use, crime, violence, racism, poverty, environmental decay, and so on. Richard Florida, the scholar and consultant often credited with popularizing the creative city model, for example, pitches the arts as a solution to urban poverty. In his book, The Rise of the Creative Class, he writes, quote, I strongly believe that the key to improving the lot of underpaid, underemployed, and disadvantaged people lies not in social welfare, nor in somehow bringing back factory jobs, but rather in tapping their innate creativity, paying them appropriately for it, and integrating them fully into the creative economy. So Florida, one of the most influential urban planners of the 21st century here, is saying that urban governments concerned with poverty should invest in the arts rather than investing in social programs or welfare, and that art alone will be enough to lift people out of poverty. This is obviously a weird idea. It contains a strange idea of what government is and what art can achieve. But the creative city model has been surprisingly influential. We see it at work in Detroit, where Florida consulted, advising the city to promote a mural district and creative brand in order to reverse years of population decline and to drive a wider revitalization. Providence, Rhode Island, another city where Florida consulted, brands itself as Creative Providence and invests in the arts in lieu of many social programs. Beyond the U.S., creative city ideas have taken hold worldwide, from Medellin, Colombia, where the arts have been used to drive the city's recovery from drug violence, to the EU, where a rotating creative capital program targets artistic investments to drive revitalization in declined cities. Take a look at your municipal government. If there's an Office of Creative Economy or something similar, it's likely that Florida's ideas are at work in planning your city. So, keeping with our show's mission to explain what is wrong with art, we're going to take today to deconstruct Florida's ideas and explore the pernicious impacts of the idea that art is a substitute for government. Thank you, everyone, for listening. You're listening to Bad Art.
Is it okay if I pick up the thread from the intro for a sec?
Yeah, yes, that'd be
Okay.
great.
So, Colin, what I found interesting about what you just told us is that the creative city promise is the promise that art can be a substitute for government.
Yes.
But actually, it sounds like even more than that. Because
Okay.
what it sounds like you're saying is that the creative city model imagines art not just as a substitute for government, but also as a substitute for all of the things that government should deliver. So, art is a substitute for government, it's a substitute for development, it's a substitute for jobs, it's a substitute for healthcare, it's a substitute for racial reconciliation policies and redistribution. Yeah, big yikes to all of that.
Yeah, big yikes. But yes, it is art is coming in to replace things that our cities used to have.
You know, we don't say this word that often on the pod because we, I think, find it too vague to be analytically useful. But the neoliberalism concept really comes to mind here, right? The reason that cities used to do all of these things is that the idea of government used to be much more robust, particularly at the local level, right? And I think part of what we see in different municipal administrations' embrace of the creative cities model is that on some level, municipal governments realize that the neoliberal turn was a dead end. And they're trying to pivot. They're trying to do something different, but they lack, I don't know, resources, economic, political, ideological, to know what that something different should be. And I think it's sort of into that neoliberal void steps this creative cities concept and seems to offer the solution to all of these problems.
Yeah, I think that's insightful. And I did, as you know, there is a note in our planning document. Let's try to say this without using the word neoliberal.
Oh, I literally did not see that. I did
Uh,
not read the planning document thoroughly enough. I apologize.
but I no, it's reasonable. We should highlight this piece of urban history, which is really the evisceration of municipal government's capacity. So, over the last 40 or 50 years, governments have become much less able to govern. And so, on the one hand, I think you're right to say that when cities can't do anything else, they turn to art. I think on the other piece of what we'll explore is that in some ways art is a mechanism for advancing the further decay of government. So that art is what we have when we don't have anything else. But art is a reason also not to have anything else. Because because as Richard Florida says, you actually don't need welfare problems. You just need to teach someone to paint. In preparing, I hope this isn't too far aside, but I was thinking, teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to paint a fish, he'll never be hungry again.
No,
But
I'm
that
glad
is
you
sort of the
said that
logic
because
here.
I was about to make a similar joke. So now it's out there. We've done it.
One thing I worry about in preparing this episode is a sense that people won't see it. So we're going to be claiming today that, you know, art is this substitute for government in so many ways. And whenever I say this to someone, I get some points of pushback. If I say it to an artist, they're like, nobody funds the arts, which isn't quite true. And if I say it to someone who's not an artist, they'll often say, well, I don't see arts in my city, so maybe that's not happening here. So there is a disconnect from what municipal planners are doing and what a lot of people see. So to bring home like the gravity of this, I was thinking about starting out with this newspaper article from a few years ago. So this is an article from 2017 in the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm from Philly, and I'm aware of this project. So it's talking about a storefront art space which opened in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, which is the center of Philadelphia's opioid crisis. And here's what it has to say. Opening. In a battle against heroin in Kensington, comma, is art an answer? Then it goes on. At the intersection of public art and public health, the Kensington storefront will house art classes, mural painting, knitting sessions, tax workshops, mental health screenings, Narcan training, and more, plus set office hours for whatever else might come up. The aim is to create a space for hope in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods and the epicenter of the opioid crisis. And then continuing just a little bit further, it quotes Jane Golden, the director of Mural Arts, which is the program running this. And she says, we can't go small. It's too serious. The problem is too overwhelming. Bold physical improvements are where we need to go. To that end, the project is expected to yield at least 2 large-scale murals and 10 smaller public art projects.
Mm.
So this has always stuck out to me, this idea. We can't go small. Let's paint 2 murals. It's like, this is how we
And
fix.
and 10 smaller possible or sorry, 10 smaller public art projects as well. It's not just the two murals.
It does go on to say they're also helping to clean up blighted properties in the area with a cohesive design sensibility. So,
I think also like the idea that murals count as physical improvements.
right.
I don't know if I buy that in general, right? One of the other services that I saw highlighted earlier in the article is I think it was either foreclosure or eviction prevention counseling. And so, thinking about like these are people who are receiving counseling to not lose their homes in an atmosphere of like financial crisis, pressures on renters and mortgage payers in an area with lots of blighted properties. And they're saying, yeah, it's the problem is really bad. We need physical improvements. And then rather than, for instance, building more housing or, remediating some of the blight to make livable properties, they're just slapping some decorations on some of the crumbling walls.
Yeah. No, it's real bleak. And I do want to hold open the possibility that Golden is somewhat misquoted or at least taken out of context here, but it still is this overwhelming sense that this is, yeah, what you need to solve this is a counseling session in an arts office, right? Like it's not like let's have
Right.
more counselors. It's in order to be able to provide counselors, we need like an art therapy room, and it's a very different idea of what government delivery is. And then everyone should have a counselor versus if they come to get the art stuff, we can like hook them up with some counseling.
My question is, do you think, like, where is this embrace of the arts as the service delivery model coming from? Do you think this is the only way to get funding for counseling, right? So it's kind of like, okay, we want to put together a counseling program. We need to dress it up as art in order to attract funding interest from the city. Or do you think it's coming from a more kind of authentic place than that?
It probably depends on who you're talking to. Like I'd like to believe that Golden is authentic in believing in art. I don't think art can do the things that she claims it can. You know what I mean? But I think,
Yeah. But you think
uh,
the optimism is real and just kind of, the cynicism is coming from funders rather than from folks building these kinds of projects on the ground.
well, so I have a few things to say about that, right? Like, so, but it's each of these art projects is a coalition, right? So you have the arts organization, you have the municipal government, you have other partners who are participating,
Are these
and
kind of like public-private partnerships,
always,
each one? Okay.
always. But one thing, this is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but one thing that Tyler Denmead has a book called The Creative Underclass. And one thing he says in there is that the creative city model, this sort of model of arts, really took off because it's a lot cheaper to paint a mural than to invest in opioid recovery or
Yeah.
counseling. So it's a cheap thing that looks like, oh, looks like we did something. There's a mural here now. It's visible. Everyone likes art. So they'll say, oh, that's nice. And I mean, this is a thing
Yeah.
that happens in Philadelphia. Everyone loves the mural program because it's makes the city more beautiful, like legitimately.
Yeah.
But it also takes away from the social services that should be going to people.
It almost, this almost puts me in mind of Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism, kind of this idea of this display of care in in the form of a mural. Yeah, this display of optimism, right? Of kind of community can do attitude while not just buildings, but people are crumbling.
Right. I think the other piece to say here, which will make that point more thoroughly, is that if you look through this article, one of the things that's included in it is a map of El Campamento, which in 2017 was a major homeless encampment where hundreds of people lived and was viewed by the city as theoretically a public health crisis. So this art space is opening up at the same time as the city goes through and clears this encampment, like with brute police force.
Hmm.
So it's a simultaneous, brutality against the homeless, and this art thing looks like we're doing something positive. The other thing to say is that some of the sponsors are real estate developers in the area. And this neighborhood's been targeted for gentrification and development for decades. I don't know that it'll ever work because it's so dense with poverty and drugs as a result of like urban planning decisions from decades ago. But there's been a long time effort because it's close to downtown to make this the next gentrifying area. And so the fact that developers and the police are partners in this arts program, that I think is quite cynical, right? And that I think, what does it mean to partner with people whose goal is to clear out the very people you're trying to help, even if you want to like assume the best on the parts of the people who are opening and running the program.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the purpose of like bringing up the storefront was to just illustrate the degree to which an optimism that art can solve your problems is in fact present in city governments. So if this is an idea that is embraced by city governments, where did it come from? And I think to get to that, we have to go back to something we've talked about before, which is the urban crisis of the 70s and 80s. In the second half of the 20th century, US cities faced, real rapid decline, in part due to the collapse of manufacturing and in part due to white flight, so suburbanization. So wealthier whites leaving the city and taking away the tax base, which meant that cities really struggled to pay for social services, resulting in cities going bankrupt, which we've talked about on the pod before. But big problems with homelessness, a lot of fear of crime, a lot of urban abandonment and decay. And so municipal governments are sort of casting around, like, how can we fix this?
Where can the revenue come from?
Where can the revenue come from? And in the late 90s, a bunch of scholars began returning studies that said, hey, arts can help. So arts can help build a city back up. And how can they do that? Well, they can attract tourism. Arts can generate business revenue. If you go to an art museum, you then buy lunch nearby. It can even reverse white flight because young suburbanites are interested in moving to dynamic urban neighborhoods where there's arts. So the arts can help attract new residents to move back into the city and overturn that history of decay. This is a nice way of saying gentrification, right? That
Right.
one of the goals of investing in arts is to drive gentrification and to bring in wealthier residents.
I'm just thinking about and okay. I'm thinking about Sex and the City.
Okay.
And I know that Sex and the City, it starts like I think it starts to air in like 2000 or 2000. Yeah, I think around the year 2000. So it's maybe a little bit later than these conversations among urban professionals in the 90s. But in some ways, you can think of Sex and the City as kind of the popular cultural response to the success of this creative cities concept. Oh, Sex and the City started to air in 1998. That's earlier than I realized. So kind of right on the money, right?
Yeah, right on the
Yeah.
money.
And especially I think in the earlier seasons of the show, like later stage Sex and the City, I have a lot of opinions on, and it becomes very much about like the love lives of the four main characters, and over time it becomes much more tightly focused on their friendships with each other and their love lives. But the first few seasons, especially, have this like much more broadly panoramic view of life in New York City. And the main characters are constantly going to gallery openings, book readings, publishing parties, the openings of new restaurants in hip neighborhoods of New York City, right? So there's this way in which I think the showrunner of Sex and the City said at the time that the fifth main character of the show was New York City, right? And the specific way in which that manifested was through this vibrant cultural and artistic scene that was always being shown. So fast forward into the 2000s now, Sex and the City has become a cultural phenomenon, and you get these Sex and the City tours around New York City, right? Where people are specifically going to spend money at the art galleries and restaurants featured on the show, right? So it's sort of a little perfect mini example of this broader phenomenon and the kinds of money that urban governments hoped to make from fostering creativity in cities. And obviously, it's like in New York City, that just kind of happens, right? And so cities that are not New York City are trying to figure out, well, how can we get some of that same energy, some of that same profit?
Yeah, that's a great connection to bring in Sex and the City and New York, right? Because New York, I think, is the paradigmatic example of arts-based development succeeding, which does become a model for elsewhere. And even as early as the 1980s, you have areas like the gentrification of the Lower East Side, for example, being driven by art galleries and music venues opening, often sponsored by developers to do that in order to like attract activity to the neighborhood.
Right. And coupled with, as you already, I think, gestured to, coupled with evicting artists from, artistic scenes also on the Lower East Side that were not part of the developer-friendly model of the arts in the area.
Right. We'll have to bookmark this for another episode, but like one thing worth talking about is how the art that gets produced actually changes when the artists are
Mm,
gentrifiers and not the urban poor. But a second piece of this is that so bringing up New York, Sex and the City, New York, Mayor Bloomberg, so starting in 2003, embraces an arts policy, right? So has like takes on, let's invest in the arts as part of building up New York. And so the arts really becomes central to New York's development plan at that time and instrumentalized. Although it focuses on museums as like tourist destinations, that becomes part of the model that filters out. But that, I mean, the question is, does it work outside New York? Like New York is a arts hub for a reason. Billings is not, you know what I mean? Or Detroit even as a cultural city is not, you know? And so how do you flip that switch?
In some ways, it's really surprising that New York was the inspiration for this whole movement, right? Because if I'm the mayor of Billings, Montana, and someone tries to sell me on Billings can be the next New York, I don't think my first response would be like, wow, what a great idea. That could totally work here.
I have a better example because when I lived in Minneapolis, my partner Jamie would request tourism magazines for all the nearby towns, like what can we go do to sightsee? And Fargo, North Dakota,
Mm,
mailed us a visit the murals of Fargo.
hmm
I don't want to talk trash, like, but quite honestly, the murals were not very good, as you'd expect from, somewhere that doesn't have a big arts budget. But it's clear that they were embracing this idea that arts is a means to attract people and drive our local economy.
Yeah. I mean, just last year, I think it was, I was in McKinney, Texas, and we were dressed up because we were going to a rehearsal dinner. And so we're just like walking through downtown. McKinney is like this affluent suburb of Dallas. And so we're dressed up, we're walking down the sidewalk. It's a Friday night, and people are like, "Oh, are you here for, wine night at the galleries?" We're like, "What?" Yeah, all the galleries in McKinney are having wine night. Just come, have a glass of wine, hang out, look at some art. It's like if even just like Lululemon suburbs have their own version of this, right? That's really tells you something about a certain cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah. So it should be said, we should add this in like that. So New York is the model, but you also have like I have a set of papers from the mid 90s which talk about rural arts. So these
Hmm.
rural areas were like, okay, how do we get money into this like small town? And it would be have arts events, have like an artistic community that can bring people in for activities and give money, like literally give money to the gas station, give money to the restaurants, pay for parking. But these would be, linchpin towns in big rural areas. So it was like, how do
Hmm.
we turn this into a destination where people are commuting in and commuting back out?
Right.
Again, quite different from any major city. But from there, we should say, okay, but if arts works to draw people in And if arts does drive gentrification from the perspective of a city official, like a mayor, this is a good thing. So we can like raise all the questions about the ethics of gentrification that we want. For municipal leaders, they want gentrification for a variety of reasons. And the big one is income tax. If people who make more money move into the city, that generates revenue for the city. The other is property tax. If the value of property goes up, that generates money for the city. And then in theory, the revenue that's coming from art-led gentrification can then be paid into social services. But in practice, that's not what happens. It goes into promoting further development. So it becomes what's called like a growth machine.
Mm. Yeah, I guess I'm also thinking about, we have these headlines coming out of New York City right now, for instance, about how since COVID, year over year, the number of school children in New York City keeps declining. So the number of children in the city is shrinking because the city has become unaffordable to live in, right? And so I would even question at this point the social services fig leaf, right? If the growth machine has become so powerful that social service users, including children, no longer can afford to live in your city, there doesn't from the creative cities mindset, there doesn't really seem to be a problem with that.
No, except that if all the creatives leave,
Right. If it gets too expensive for creatives, then you have a problem.
then the city collapses because it's no longer a fun place to be.
Right.
So you have these schemes to make housing affordable for artists, but not for anyone else. So, I mean, you look around Philadelphia, Baltimore, a number of other cities, Minneapolis, I'm aware of, have public housing for artists, basically. Like,
Hmm.
subsidized artist lofts.
LA.
Yeah. And so many cities are using this as like, we need to keep our artists, so we'll provide housing for them, not for the urban poor.
Because the artists can make us money if we subsidize their housing. Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about like all of this is so cynical that it's really difficult to treat it as a good faith solution to anything.
Well, let's try. So let's try to engage it. It's hard because we were just talking about Mayor Bloomberg, and he's not sincere about anything, right? So fuck him.
Yeah.
But if you are a small town or like a medium city mayor or city council person in the late 90s, it's possible to firmly believe that you need to raise the revenue so that you can like get your city out of the bankruptcy, start investing
Hmm.
in schools, start investing in, other public programs that have struggled, that have failed because there's no money.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think also one thing that helps me wrap my head around this is, today the creative city model of development is kind of the last man standing of these different development models. But if I think back to like the mid to late 90s, I think there were other competing ideas about how urban development could work, right? So you had, for instance, these kind of like riverfront redevelopment projects, which you can also see a version of in Brooklyn, for instance. Or I'm thinking about like the Inner Harbor in Baltimore was another kind of earlier example of this. So you had like the riverfront redevelopment model. You had kind of the tech hub redevelopment model, right? This was before the consolidation in the Bay Area and around Seattle. And so there was, I think, still this idea that tech could become a driver of development for cities kind of all over the United States. There's probably others that I'm missing, but yeah, it sort of helps me to understand this moment better if I think of it as a moment where there were several competing efforts to think creatively about what could help cities recover, with creative cities as just one option on a larger menu of options. And I imagine that city governments were trying to think really carefully about what are the resources in their communities, right? And so, yeah, maybe that helps me feel a little bit less cynical about it if I think about, these city governments just kind of trying to figure out, well, what do we have that we can build on?
Yeah. And I mean, also, it's cheaper than a lot of those big infrastructure projects.
Yes.
It's interesting you mentioned tech, because I think it's probably a reasonable time for start shifting into talking about Richard Florida, like the center of the creative city idea. And in his book, The Rise of the Creative Class, he says everyone's trying to be Silicon somewhere, so he's like really highlighting that all of these different cities are competing to attract tech, but don't know how. Whereas he's got a model that will attract business and economy. And so he really puts it forward as this is more successful than those other things you've been trying to do.
More successful at attracting tech specifically.
Partly, actually, yeah. So, so Florida's thesis. So one thing to say about Florida, he's sort of picking up on the way that some cities and municipalities have begun investing in art for tourism and gentrification in the 90s. And he says, like, this is an economic transition that before cities were driven by manufacturing, today they're driven by creativity.
Is this just another way of saying cities are moving to a service economy? Like, is creativity just a gloss on the service economy?
Sort of, not exactly.
Mm.
So he accepts the service economy. He says, yeah, there's service and it sucks, right? Like you work a service job, you get minimum wage, but this is what a lot of the economy has become since manufacturing is done. But then there's creativity. So service doesn't make any money. Creativity makes money because creativity makes things. Creativity works with the ideas. The ideas are worth money. This is where economic generation happens.
Because services don't make things?
Delivery, gas pumping. This is sort of what he thinks of as services is like,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
Gotcha. Because, for instance, I'm thinking about like restaurants, right? Is a restaurant part of the creative economy or part of the service economy?
the chef is a creative.
Oh, but everyone else.
Everyone else is. So yeah, he's got a really weird idea of what it means to be creative. So we should be clear. Like he's talking about artists, but not primarily. He's actually talking about stockbrokers and tech executives
Those are the
and
real creatives.
and copyright attorneys. So you say, what do you mean that this is creative? He says, well, they all work with their mind. So the creative class, as Florida understands it, is basically somewhat tautological. It's like anyone who makes money must be working with their mind and therefore is creative.
Okay. I might be getting ahead of myself in
Mm.
asking this, but it feels like the natural follow-up to what you just said is, so how did we get from Florida's original idea that the creatives are mind workers like copyright attorneys and stockbrokers to the widespread embrace of painting murals in cities?
Yeah, good question. So there's a sort of a two-step process. Florida says that the creatives are a different type of worker, different type of person than either the service workers.
A different type of person?
Oh, yeah, they're creative.
I hate this so much. Like everything that I learn about it makes me hate it more. This feels like one of those kind of key building blocks of the tech authoritarianism in which we live.
For sure. So he will say everyone has inherent creativity.
But some people are more creative than others.
Some people are more creative than others, and he's interested in how those people work. Those people have certain things that they do differently than everyone else. So, one thing about creatives is that according to him, they choose where they live, right? So, factory workers would, if they migrated, they would migrate to a better factory, right? Like great migration story of the US, that people would go to where the jobs were, and that led to the rise of the cities. Service workers are kind of stuck. But creative workers, they go to choose where to live. And what you see are the emergence of creative hubs where lots of creative class people are living. And he says the goal of municipal governments should be to attract the creative class to their cities. One, because the creative class is itself economically generative, but two, because employers value creatives. So tech companies, advertising companies, design companies, like a lot of these companies, tech is a big one for him, are going to go to the place where the creatives are in order to be able to feed off of that creative economy that's there. So by attracting creatives, cities can then attract industry. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It just doesn't feel true.
No, it doesn't feel true. But this is the argument. We can get to like a couple of things that are wrong with that in a minute.
Yeah, and by the way, I still don't feel like I have an answer to how did we get from this to murals.
Well, what do creatives like?
Murals?
They like murals.
Oh,
They like parks. They like cafes. They like nice third spaces. They like cities that are fun to live in. They like places where there's dynamic events you can attend.
so basically, the idea is you should turn your city into a playground for people making, a higher level of income from their creative work.
Yes, but a very specific kind of playground, an artistic playground. Because they are creative, they're going to want arts.
Ah, because they're creative. So copyright attorneys, they really like to look at art when they're not working on copyrights.
This is his thesis. It's really confused at that specific point is that he slides between creative, by which he means copyright attorneys, and artists, like really easily.
Mm,
And so like there are points where he's talking and it's like, oh, this makes sense if you're talking about artists, but does it make sense if you're talking about copyright attorneys, if you're talking
right.
about stockbrokers? Because he'll say, artists are historically tolerant. Not always true, but like he has this posit that cities should be tolerant in order to attract the creative class, right? That a creative city needs to be diverse because that's what this class will want to feel like they're in the right kind of place. They'll want to be gay friendly.
It also I understand that he's trying to pitch his argument by making this sound like it's a series of sociological conclusions about what
Hmm.
creatives are like. But what it sounds more like happened, regardless of the gloss that Florida wants to put on it, is that he looked at, a data set of maybe like 2 to 3 cities where stockbrokers and attorneys and software designers live. So maybe you're looking at New York City, Seattle, and San Francisco. And then he said, well, what do these cities have? How could I turn this into, a generic set of recommendations and then make like broad sociological claims about why this generic set of recommendations makes sense?
That's probably close to true. I think he probably worked with a bigger data set
You think
because,
there were 5 or 6 cities instead of 2 or 3?
well, he says he came up with something he calls a creativity index, which measures how much different cities invest in creativity and where creatives are located the most. And then noted that that overlapped with economic generation, IT, and also I should read this to you. So he says, I had been exploring the location decisions of high-tech industries and talented people. His friend, someone named Gates, had been exploring the location patterns of gay people. My list of the country's high-tech hotspots looked an awful lot like his list of places with the highest concentrations of gay people. When we compared the two lists with greater statistical rigor, his gay index turned out to correlate very strongly with my measures of high-tech growth. Other measures I came up with, like the Bohemian Index, a measure of the density of artists, writers, and performers in a region, produced similar results. My conclusion was that rather than being driven exclusively by companies, economic growth was occurring in places that were tolerant, diverse, and open to creativity because these were places where creative people wanted to live.
This is such bad quantitative analysis. I'm really cringing here. So he uses the word correlate, and yet at no point does it occur to him that maybe the correlation between these different indices has some larger cause. No,
Yeah.
it must be a causative relationship between all of these clearly. And clearly the X factor is creativity.
So yeah, you're pointing to the bad methodology. I think we should also point to the bad stakes, which is that he says basically racism, homophobia, it's going to be solved by the creative city, by a market mechanism,
Right.
because this is where the high tech people want to move. So if your city wants to be it, it has to be. That's it. It's done.
He's basically saying there's no market demand for racism or homophobia, so those things will wither away.
Yes. And there's no need for like robust anti-racism programs or inclusivity programs. You just need to have like the right kind of city market-wise, right? But there's no need for these programs because urban developers will build it naturally in an effort to attract the best and the brightest.
Right. They'll just respond to incentives and all of our problems will be solved.
And so you hit on the quantitative methodology being sketchy, the correlation and causation being confused. Another thing here is like this idea of what creatives want is not interrogated, right? The idea that creatives are naturally tolerant people. At times, artists have been, but that's historically specific. And the extension of that to everyone he wants to call creative doesn't make sense. Like stockbrokers are conservative, right? Like, so,
Yeah.
like this idea, or tech, as we know, doesn't need to be inclusive of race or sexuality because as soon as they get like this Elon Musk tip, now they're fascist, right? So
Right.
this idea is very specific.
I think like I don't necessarily want to say that we should blame Richard Florida for like not anticipating the techlash. I think there are plenty of other people who were publishing books in the 2000s who also did
Of
not
course.
anticipate that tech would eventually go kind of to the opposite end of the political spectrum, right? But I think the larger idea that someone's occupation does not make them into an ideologically stable kind of person. I think that's the more important point, right? That, um, okay, I mean, this is Marx, right? Like, ideology is contingent. Yes, it reflects relations of production, but we can't actually make you can't trace a straight line from where someone sits in a class hierarchy to what exactly their ideology is going to be,
Right.
right? But this is making exactly that mistake. It's saying because we know someone's economic position in this like oversimplified economy that only has manufacturing, services, and brain workers slash creatives, therefore we can know for all of time from now until forever what their preferences will be in
Right.
terms of how they imagine their lives.
Yeah. And wherever they live, like it is a really funny thing to imagine
Yeah.
this continuity.
It's it's so funny to me to imagine this author who is making like these very flash in the pan judgments about the preferences of a particular class of workers at a moment in time. And on the basis of those judgments, he's making investment recommendations to cities about how they should structure their development plans for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Right.
And it's crazy to me, again, that cities really did make long range planning decisions on the basis of these, you know, incredibly, what do I want to call it? Like they made these investment decisions based on these highly contingent cultural moments and the people that inhabited them.
Yeah. But it's worth here saying something about the success. So I think we both squirm at the impacts. Like the social impacts of this are not good. It doesn't It doesn't end homophobia or racism as we can predict. It doesn't, as he also says, it doesn't resolve uh, environmental problems because people want to live in sustainable cities. Like none of the problems that he claims it will fix are fixed, but it does achieve something, which is like the revitalization economically of these depressed cities. So, for example, in Detroit, Florida is a consultant on the rebuilding of Detroit, and what they do is they set up a square because Detroit's very large. They cut off services to everything else, and within this square, they prioritize redevelopment and art, paint tons of murals, big Shepherd Ferry murals, like graffiti festivals and things to drive gentrification. And it works from a developer perspective that there is an economic generation in downtown Detroit that is promoted through celebrating Detroit as a creative hub or this small area of Detroit as a creative hub, which has really propped up real estate values. Now, what else has it done is displaced black people. It's cut off services to the rest of the city. Like they cut off water to large swaths of the city at some point. But the goal of like generating income for the city has worked, and it's worked in a number of places.
And I think that the overall level of satisfaction that people have with this creative cities approach to development, and by people here, I mean like decision makers in city government, so politicians, the people who donate to politicians, et cetera, they're generally pretty satisfied with this approach, right? And the reason that they're satisfied with it, as you said, is because it did make them money. It did raise tax revenues for a lot of the cities in which it was applied. That's not to say it was successful everywhere, right?
No,
But it worked at that very narrow goal of growing the tax base in a lot of places and of growing the population, right? Like in Detroit, the big deal was kind of resettlement following decades of white flight. But the fact that people are so happy with this narrow range of outcomes speaks to the same thing as the flimsiness of Florida's arguments for why this would help solve racism or sustainability, which is that nobody cared about those things in the first place.
right, right. Or only on the most superficial of levels.
Right. They wanted maybe to be able to assert that they cared, but none of this was really about that.
You know, as someone I've cited on this show quite a lot points out, so Alesia Montgomery, right? It's not only that it doesn't solve racism in Detroit, it makes it worse. And you have, you know, the gentrification, the art often celebrates Detroit's black history, but it celebrates it for white gentrifiers who are kicking the black people out, you know? And this racial violence is accelerated by creative city development rather than undermined.
Because it turns out that what the white creative class wants is not so much diversity as the appearance of diversity.
Right, the image. So on that note, so we've been talking about Florida. I wanted to also bring in another consultant, urban planning consultant, who builds on Florida's ideas but adds to them in some significant ways. And so this is Charles Landry, and he wrote a book called The Creative City Toolkit for Innovators. And he also gives, just like Florida, he gives lectures to urban planners and politicians, suggesting this is a way to spur economic development in your city. And I just want to highlight two major contributions from Landry. One is to really specify how art can be a tool of urban branding. So one of the things that art can do, in his view, is find what's special about your city and sell that in a competitive place. If everyone's trying to compete for this select group of creatives to come to their city, this kind of branding can be helpful, except that everyone's doing it, right? But like that's not something he says. It's, you know, it's a way of like making your city special.
Right. And, if everyone's doing it, that just means you need to be branding better than every other city.
Yeah. The other thing that he says is that a creative city will make its residents more creative, by which he means sort of they will become more art like artists. And here's how he understands artists. They're self-driven, problem solvers, not reliant on others. So artist and entrepreneur are almost synonyms in his book. And there's an idea that the creative city will make people more like artists. Well, what is this? They're uh, not reliant on welfare. They're hustling. So hustling to get ahead, doing a lot of the work that government maybe could do in some other place. They're scrapping by. They're not deterred by poverty because there's an imagination of a big payoff at the end. You know, like they're working through the starving artist thing. So it's turning the entire population into starving artists in a way. And it is this advance, like it's pre-hustle culture that he writes this, but it is anticipating this idea
Mm,
that the city is going to become a place where everyone is working gig jobs because they've got a real passion somewhere else, you know,
mm.
and they're not going to be relying on the city to solve their problems.
Yeah, right. So working a DoorDash job is the same as being an artist in this
In
imaginary.
this imagination, absolutely.
Yeah, that is bleak AF.
Bleak AF. So he presents a lot of examples of the creative city at work in his book. So they're like 50 of these. If you wanna like see what stands out to you and maybe read one of those for the audience.
Let me skim them and pick one that resonates with me.
And what I want to point out to the listeners is what you're going to be reading is his idea of what a creative city can accomplish in terms of creative problem solving that fixes like a city's problems without relying on like intense government bureaucracy.
Oh, okay. I found one.
Okay.
Okay. So one of his examples of what the creative city can accomplish is called Linking Garbage Collection to Education, Bangalore, India. In Bangalore, a recycling initiative is interwoven with public education, health, economic, and anti-social exclusion programs to establish a multiply sustainable initiative. Citizens are encouraged by the city corporation to separate their waste into wet and dry. Previously marginal rag pickers, many of whom are children, all of whom are exposed to a high risk of disease, are trained as waste retrievers. Traveling by tricycle, they retrieve the waste for a wage. Their literacy skills are also developed. Wet waste is composted in lined pits in city parks and later sold. Dry waste is sold at affordable prices to local industry, and soiled/toxic waste is safely disposed by the city corporation. Citizens forums monitor the process to ensure and perpetuate local agency. A city level committee, Swabimana, of city corporation officers and health and education workers maintain the initiative as part of a comprehensive and coordinated citywide strategy.
Sounds creative, doesn't it?
Very creative because you have children riding tricycles who are picking up toxic waste and then putting it somewhere. So the only children who have to be exposed to the toxic waste are the ones who work as rag pickers. That's great for everyone.
It is like a child labor, like just like hooray, child
Yeah.
labor.
Hooray for child labor. Hooray for putting these incredibly vulnerable kids in a situation where they're literally handing toxic waste and calling that a win for everyone.
And it claims that their literacy skills are also developed. It does not explain how. Like I assume it's
No.
like being able to read that this says trash. You know what I mean? It's like, so this sounds stupid. It sounds like I am like, picking a straw man argument. Like, but all of his things are like this. It's like, oh, in this city, they got the homeless to sell newspapers. There are multiple examples of like kids picking up trash. There's like,
I'm also like, I'm just thinking about, I used to live in Baltimore. I think I've mentioned that on the pod before. And in Baltimore, we have, well, I don't live there anymore, so I shouldn't say we have, but a lot of people who live in Baltimore consider the phenomenon of squeegee kids to be like a public nuisance. and a problem for the city. So, for those who have not heard this term before, I'm sure this is not like the terms must vary from place to place. But for instance, in Buenos Aires, where I'm from, there's kids who work a very similar kind of occupation. But this is basically when you're stopped at a red light, there are children and teenagers who have like a spray bottle of like a windshield cleaning solution and squeegees, and they offer to clean your car while you're stopped at the light, or clean the windshields of the car while you're stopped at the light. And so in Baltimore, there's a lot of social division around this. Like, you obviously have your good urban liberals, imagine scare quotes around all of those words, who say like these are just kids trying to make pocket money, like, be nice to them. And then you have your urban cynics who say these kids should be in school, and also they are threatening my vehicle by, offering to squeegee it. And actually, the squeegee kids are in that imaginary. The squeegee kids are like a sign of the violent decay of the city. But I think the broader point, right, is like nobody is right about this.
Right.
Like, it's not good that squeegee kids have to work as squeegee kids to make extra money. Like, yeah, they probably should be in school. It's also not good that people view them with suspicion and hostility and mistreat them because of the work they're doing, right? So, like, every city has its version of the squeegee kids. And the idea of talking that up as a win for some model of urban development rather than recognizing it as an abdication of the government's responsibilities is heartbreaking to me.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the thing I wanted to land on, like the abdication of the government's responsibilities. Like squeegee kids, if I encounter them, I think I should be nice, right? Like they are legitimately, trying to get by, make some pocket money, whatever else they might be doing. But in a functional society, in the richest country ever to exist, they should just have food, They should
Yeah.
just be well supported in school. They shouldn't have to hustle. And it's not actually that hard or expensive for them to be taken care of in a way that doesn't put them out into this precarious position where they're standing in traffic, exposed to angry people driving by. Similarly with homeless people, like they shouldn't have to sell a shitty newspaper to be valued, and they should just have access to the basic resources that they need and that can be achieved. But we've decided instead, no, we're going to give them art, you know, or we're going to
And
give them this like facsimile of an artist's life, which is
right.
starving. And now you're a hustler because you're spraying on the windshield so that you can do the thing you really want later.
Right. It really is like this kind of trickle down version of entrepreneurial creativity, right? So at the top you have the mind workers who use their creative spirits to make, millions of dollars. And at the bottom you have squeegee kids, kids picking toxic waste out of people's trash, homeless people selling newspapers. And somehow it's good that they are, learning this entrepreneurial mindset. Will it make them millions of dollars? Will we ever recognize them as mind workers? Of course not. But what matters is that they're hustling.
Well, they're, it's a step on the train, right? Like it's a step in the direction of now they're working every day, they're learning what it takes to make something. The next step,
And so then eventually they'll become stockbrokers.
eventually they'll become stockbrokers because now they
Mm.
have the like ingrained skills from doing this thing.
They've
Um,
learned how to draw a fish.
they've learned how to draw a fish. I feel like I want to read the quote that I opened with again. I think I want to come back to that because it's so grotesque, but it is everything we've been talking about. Richard Florida says, I strongly believe that the key to improving the lot of the underpaid, underemployed, and disadvantaged lies not in social welfare programs or low-end make-work jobs, nor in somehow bringing back the factory jobs of the past, but rather in tapping their innate creativity, paying them appropriately for it, and integrating them fully into the creative economy. Um, this is what that looks like.
Except it doesn't because because that last line, tapping their innate creativity, paying them appropriately, and integrating them into the local economy. Which of those things can be said to have happened for trash pickers?
Right.
Maybe the first one. I would say we're still not really tapping their innate creativity as human beings. Surely trash pickers have a lot more to offer the world through their minds and their hearts than being able to pick through the trash. But you can maybe stretch it and say, okay, they've learned how to creatively, fill a niche in a local economy. Are they integrated into that local economy in a meaningful way? No. Are they being paid a fair wage for their labor? Hell no.
Well, so you're reminding me there's a important critique of Florida by Ollie Mould, which goes into like all of his methodological mess, like really tears him apart. But one thing it settles on is that Florida presupposes that there has to be a service class and a creative class. Like for the creative class to work, it has to be served. It has to be provided
Hmm.
with things. And, they need the restaurants and cafes, right? As like locations for creativity to happen. So
Right,
you need waiters, you need baristas. So there's never actually going to be full incorporation. Not everyone can be a creative. It depends on a class hierarchy. And what it really is a justification for this intense and intensifying inequality, which plays out along lines of
right.
class and race.
And of course, that also points to the ways in which this creative cities model in some places is starting to look like its own undoing,
Right.
right? So I mentioned the affordability crisis in New York City earlier. One of the things that is happening in New York right now is that the service class can't afford to live there and, make the coffee or deliver the groceries or do the dry cleaning. So if a city has so successfully pursued this creative cities model of development that, raises rents to a level where the service class can't live there, suddenly all of the amenities that the creatives move there for start to disappear.
Right.
And then where do they go? Right? Do they end up in a city that works as kind of a gated enclave with service workers commuting in from several hours away, which is what you see in the Bay Area?
Right.
Or does something else need to happen, right? Like, I think what is exciting about Mayor Mamdani is that his election shows maybe something else can happen as a result of this creative cities development project. Maybe it doesn't have to be this devastating dead end that we've been gesturing at. Not through any merits of the creative cities project in and of itself, but rather through people's rejection of that model.
Yeah. Actually, that's something he's been quite explicit about, right? Is like saying, the arts should be affordable to everyone.
Hmm.
So making arts accessible, and that includes rent, like that being able to live in the city is part of that. So yeah, it is an explicit thing that he's championed and does provide some hope. I think I was glad you mentioned the Bay Area because it is certainly the most dystopian example of this
Yeah.
as tech has just sort of hollowed it out, especially San Francisco, into some kind of like zombie city where the service class routinely lives more than 2 hours away and commutes, which is just horrifying. But it's the city that this model builds is either a city of that just level of desperation or a zombie city, an empty city, a gated enclave where there's a creative class but no creativity.
Right. I did want to ask you, thinking about that idea of a creative class with no creativity, is it possible to update the creative cities paradigm for this age of AI? Because it's starting to feel like all of these mind workers are about to be put out of a job. Or at least that's the claim coming from our tech overlords, right? I don't always believe that claim, but you know, recently I've started to see some corners of the labor movement get more serious about planning for what will labor have to do in the age of AI. And I guess I'm wondering, are cities thinking about how they're going to have to adjust their city planning that is built on the backs of attracting and retaining the creative class in the age of AI?
That's an interesting question. I certainly am very skeptical of the AI hype. Like so I think there are a lot of things that it's not going to deliver.
I'm right there with you.
But that doesn't mean that people won't get fired on the promise that their job can be replaced.
And it doesn't mean so, one, people can still get fired on the promise that their job will be replaced. Two, there is a monetary and cultural devaluation of
Hmm.
creative skills happening, right?
Yeah.
In every creative sector, whether that's software design or mural making or film production. So I think that's, to my mind, the kind of biggest threat to the cachet of the creative city model, right? The creative city model worked on two levels. One is the level of making money, growing tax revenue, but the other is a level of cultural capital, right? Cities competed to attract creatives, not just because they were wealthy, but because they were culturally desirable residents to have, right? What city didn't want to be seen as innovative, entrepreneurial, on the cutting edge,
Right.
alive in a way that other cities were not, right? But if those traits no longer matter to our modern economy, then what?
That's a strong question. I feel like I'm still going to push back and at the risk of defending the creative city concept, which I don't want to do. But
I'm glad I forced you to go there just because it'll be funny.
you did force me to go there. But I mean, I think one thing I see among many people I talk to is a revulsion at the lack of humanity in AI, right? The fact that like this is being claimed as creative or being claimed as a replacement for human services. I think people are out and looking for the real human thing, right? Like whatever they understand that to mean. And I think one way that creative cities are poised to adjust is by to providing like actual human activities where people get together and do artistic things together, whether it's attending a concert or whatever else. So I think that its emphasis on creating these spaces of creativity and collaboration will have a lasting attraction on, the wealth generators, however you want to like phrase them. So I don't think it's going away. And I think that, you know, put into the right framework that belief in human connection would be valuable. It's unfortunate that it's put in the service of a very violent operation of capitalist development. Something at its core is correct. You know what I mean? And like, if we could capture that and hold on to it, it
Yeah.
would be a good thing.
I agree with you there. I think there's a core idea to the creative cities model that is attractive, right? The idea of having civic spaces and third spaces where people can express themselves in their full humanity, is a really attractive model of an inclusive public sphere. And it certainly is not the way in which this form of development has been operationalized a lot of the time. But that doesn't mean that it can't be, right?
Right.
And so I think that, I agree with you. There's something humanly and strategically appealing about saying, well, this is the model of development that a lot of us live with already, right? We do live in cities that have these offices of the creative arts. So therefore, what can we do with them?
Right.
How can we press them to move in the direction that we would want to see for some of the promise of this idea to be realized in a more inclusive way?
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking, like there's a piece of the creative idea, city idea, which is the city should be a place where you want to live, which is good.
Yes.
The piece that misses it should also be a place where you are able to live.
Hmm.
You know, like like that provides, that protects, that secures. Like these sorts of things are not part of the creative city. But the idea should be a nice place. That's okay. You know?
Yes. Yes. Let's not throw out the idea that cities should be places that we want to live. I think there's this piece about like neighborism that, it's funny, like I've been thinking about neighborism since like 2014, and now I'm starting to see that concept have salience in the US in ways that I never expected it to have. But maybe neighborism is the missing piece here. So
Um,
the idea that to make it a city where we're able to live, where we're protected and safe, is a project that involves all of us, right? Involves our government, but also involves all of us.
a question. Do you think that the salience of neighborism is a response to the assault on civil society by Trump and others?
100%. And maybe we should do a neighborism episode of the pod. I think that that would be fun. And it would help me work out some ideas that I should probably write into an article at some point. But historically, if you think about neighborism in Spain, which is where I first became acquainted with this concept, neighborism emerged during the Francoist dictatorship, precisely because civil society had been, not entirely closed off, but like largely closed off. And certainly its ability to influence public policy was extremely, extremely limited. And so it was in that context that people turned to neighborly alliances and neighborly associations as a way to rebuild civic society. And depending on which historians of modern Spain you talk to, eventually led to kind of the toppling of the dictatorship through their rebuilding of civil society. But yeah, I think neighborism and civil society sort of go hand in hand in a way that is really generative.
Yeah. So, and perhaps an alternate model to thinking about a city we want to live in. We're going to leave it there. We got to go work our hustle jobs, our second jobs. Got to drive DoorDash, got to make ends meet in this, lovely city or cities that we live in. So we'll do that for now. We'll talk to you next time. I'm Colin McLaughlin-Alcock,
I'm Mary Algushko. Talk to you next time.
and you've been listening to Bad Art, the world's premier anti-art podcast. Bye, everybody.